classic. So obviously, right, I'm preaching the weekend's masses, and God bless you all for listening to me again this week. I'd like to preface this whole homily by suggesting, and maybe for your own interior conversation, have you ever been asked a question that's really hard to answer? That you it was hard to know, I don't even know what I would say. Okay, I have one for you this afternoon. Hard question to answer of the day. What is the most beautiful thing you've ever seen? What's the most beautiful thing that you've ever seen? If you had to pick one thing, what would it be? Now, maybe a few of us here would have an immediately something that comes to mind, but most of us probably, me included, would say, I have no idea. That's a really hard question. I can think of lots of beautiful things that I've seen in my life. How can I possibly choose one? There's been so many. So I was thinking about that, praying about that this week, and I thought there's even only one remote possibility that I could attempt to answer that question, and that's if you allowed me to tell you what's the most beautiful natural sight I've ever seen and what's the most beautiful man-made sight I've ever seen. I feel like that's enough of a difference that we can kind of cheat a little bit and just say, all right, well, at least do this and do that. So,
Father Brian, if we were married, there'd only be one right answer.
That's true.
My wife, right?
All of the husbands out there are right now saying, honey, you're the most beautiful I've ever seen. So, given the fact that this is universally true, right? We're not questioning that, right? The most beautiful natural thing I've ever seen. If I had to put it on just one thing, and man, that's tough. I think probably what I would do is I would go back to the first time in my life that I can ever recall being legitimately stunned by something so extraordinary that it just kind of stopped me in my tracks. You know, we've seen a lot of beautiful things out there. A lot of beautiful things in nature, right? Sunrises, oceans, beaches, being in the middle of the mountains or the forest. I mean, all kinds of stuff. For me, the first time I was ever super stunned by something that I saw was when I was 13 years old and I saw the Grand Canyon for the first time in my life. Some of you here maybe have seen the Grand Canyon before. It is like nothing else that you've ever seen in your life. And what's interesting about seeing the Grand Canyon is the context in which it happens. So whenever you go to see the Grand Canyon, you drive there, but it's a canyon. So you don't actually see the Grand Canyon until literally it kind of seems like it comes out of nowhere. You know, we think, oh, look, the Rockies, they're in the distance, we're getting closer. You can kind of anticipate it. But I remember when we were driving there, it was like, where are we going? We're in the middle of nowhere. And then literally all of a sudden, we're at the edge of a cliff, and we're like, oh, now we're at the Grand Canyon. Didn't see that one coming. And so you walk out onto the edge of the Grand Canyon, and I just looked around, and it's so huge, you can't even see all of it at once. You have to look around to see it. And I thought that very thing, I was like, this is the biggest thing in my life that I've ever seen. Like, by far, the biggest thing in my life that I've ever seen. And you look at gorge after gorge after gorge, and you see how wide it is and how deep it is, and you're like, I'm not even looking at a little bit of this canyon. There's so much of this canyon that I can't even see unless I go 30 miles that way and look at more of the canyon. And you see all the layers, right, that go down. And you guys know as well as I do, I could talk to you for 3 hours about what the Grand Canyon is like. I could show you 500 pictures of what it looks like. I could show you film all day of this natural wonder, and it just wouldn't do, we all know that it just wouldn't be the same as if you saw it with your own eyes. And that's really the only way at the end. Sometimes we get to that point in a conversation, we're like, oh, man, I don't know how to describe it for you. You just have to see it for yourself. This is what beautiful things do. They kind of compel you. You have to just see it for yourself. There's no way that you could ultimately kind of translate that to someone else. You have to experience it personally. So that would be for me the most beautiful natural thing, extraordinary. Imagine this, think about this, like looking out at something so massive and, oh, that was the tip of God's finger. Just kind of carving that on that patch of earth. And how big God must be to have made something so grand like that. And if we were to go sort of the other direction, okay, what is the most beautiful sort of man-made structure or man-made crafted thing out there, besides, of course, all the wives, which we know are the most beautiful in the world, right? But we're not going to cheat that way. Well, for me, if I had to put it down into one, I would say the most beautiful sight that I've ever seen made by man is St. Peters Basilica. Again, like another super privileged moment in my life that I had never thought that I would ever see in person. But I tell you what, man, when you go and you walk into St. Peter's Square for the first time and you look at the facade of that church, it has a lot of similarities as an experience like the Grand Canyon, because you look up and it's so big, you can't see all of it at once. You have to look around at it in order to see all of it. I was like, this is huge. And it is. St. Peter's Basilica is the largest Christian church in the world by size. It's massive, absolutely extraordinary. I looked around at it and I said, this thing was built in the 1500s, this structure. How did they get the stones up there? That's so high. I mean, they didn't have hydraulics or super fancy cranes and steel structures. They had ramps and pulleys and manpower. You know, it's incredible to think that this was even possible. You look at the facade and you notice those front columns. And from here, you're like, oh, those front columns look nice. You walk up next to one of those columns, the pedestal on which that column sits is literally as big as this altar space up here in the front. It's huge. Pictures, right? They just don't do it justice. And the only thing that really compares to looking at St. Peter's Basilica is actually going on the inside of it. Because as big as it is on the outside, it's as exquisite on the inside. Every single thing, nearly, on the inside of that basilica from floor to ceiling was handcrafted, hand-cut, custom-curved marble or gold filigree. Every detail. And it's enormous. You go to the middle of that basilica and you look up at the dome. And underneath that dome, I probably have told you this before, you could stack 2.5 space shuttles on top of each other and you wouldn't get to the top of that dome. It's so high up. And from there, right, you're looking right up next to the altar underneath that big dark brass structure. It's the largest freestanding brass structure in the world. Very heavy. That's called a baldacchino. It has big 4 columns. It sits like a canopy over the high altar. That's almost 100 feet tall. It's like a 10-story brass structure. And it just sits like this in a basilica, all the way down here. It's amazing. Like, how do we even know how to cut stone like that? How do we even know how to forge brass like that in place, right? I mean, they would have had to, they were not going to bring that whole thing through the front door. They would have been forging it on the basilica floor. It's amazing. Why do I even preface this whole homily like this? It's good for us to, I think, consider this question and the difficulty that kind of arises from it, because it helps us to understand why during Christmastide we have something called Epiphany and why it's important for us to celebrate Epiphany. Epiphany is akin to what happens when you are so stunned by something beautiful that, like, you can call it to mind immediately. Isn't this what beauty impresses itself upon you? It, like, forms itself. It, like, puts its fingerprint in your mind. It changes you forever. You can't unsee that. And when we consider even from the top to the bottom, from the beginning to the end of all human history, this very experience, the experience of seeing something beautiful, is at every step along the way. Go back to chapter 1 of the book of Genesis, and what do you find? You find that at the very beginning, when God created all things, right on each day of creation, at the end of that day, it says God looked at what he saw. He looked at what he created, and he saw that it was good. And at the culmination, on the last day of creation, the 6th day of creation, he looks out at the human race, the pinnacle of his creation, and he says, oh, that was really good. Like God gave himself a double pat on the back for that one, right? No, I did good. That was good on that one. So vision, seeing the beautiful, the original blessing of creation. The original blessing of creation was the blessing of God's vision upon his creation. And this vision was shared, right, with the light of the human race. And you and I all know that it's awesome to look at beautiful things and that those things change us as well. But it's also true sometimes vision is dangerous. Seeing things is sometimes not so good. And you really don't have to go even much farther after chapter 1. Go to chapter 3 of Genesis, and what happens? What happens in chapter 3 of Genesis is that the serpent comes before Adam and Eve, and he wants to separate them from God's loving plan. So what does he do? He has them look at something. This great original blessing of creation, the gift of vision, the gift of seeing God's goodness expressed in creation. And Satan says, use that gift. Look and see now at the tree of the knowledge of good and evil. See how pleasing it is to the eye for food. See how desirable it is in the heart for gaining wisdom. Go ahead, take some. And we were duped, right? We were fooled by what we saw. And we took it, and we ate it, and we fell from grace. And what was the consequence of that fall from grace? It says, as soon as Adam and Eve ate from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, their eyes were opened. Their eyes were opened unto evil. They began to see something that they had never seen before. For the first time, they saw injustice, they saw infidelity, they saw lack of righteousness. But their eyes were also closed. Their vision was also taken from them. Because in their fall from grace, they lost the vision of God. In fact, this was the greatest loss of the fall of the human race, was the loss of the vision of God. The very original, the very first blessing of creation. And we still live in a world where that's true. God is everywhere. God is literally everywhere. Every place of creation, God is there. How come you can't just look around and see him right now? Shouldn't we be able to see God right now? He is here. He's in the air between us. He's around us. He's in these columns, right? He's living inside of us. Like, why can't we just see God? Well, because we still, in a broken world, have this blessing not with us. So in the fall, God saw that his people lost the blessing of right vision, and he said, I'm going to return that to you. He made them a promise. As soon as they fell from grace, he said, I'm going to send a descendant after you. It's going to be born from the human race, who's going to come and save the human race and return to the human race what the human race has lost. All throughout the history of God's holy people, all throughout the times of the prophets themselves would often use this analogy, the analogy of vision, of seeing, in order to describe the good things that God was going to do. You just literally heard it in the first reading. Were you paying attention? Did you hear it? These words just kind of flow over us, but what are they saying? What are the actual words? Look, Isaiah says to Jerusalem, see. Darkness covers the earth and thick clouds cover the peoples. But see, upon you the Lord shines. Over you appears God's glory. Nations shall walk by your light. Nations and kings shall walk by your shining radiance. Raise your eyes and look about. They all gather and come to you. And then you shall be radiant at what you see, Isaiah says. And because of what you see, your heart shall throb and overflow. For the riches of the sea shall be emptied out before you. The wealth of the nations shall be brought to you. The prophets say God is going to return to you his blessing, and you're going to see it. The vision is going to be with you. And this is how you will know. You'll see it. The entire premise of the story of Epiphany depends upon seeing. I mean, the three magi would never have made the journey, the trip to Jerusalem and then to Bethlehem, if they did not first literally look up into the sky and notice by looking into the sky that a new star was rising that was heralding a newborn king. And so then they made this really calculated and I imagine expensive journey with all of their retinue that they took with them, their treasures and their people, and they traveled west to Jerusalem, then to Bethlehem. But how would they have possibly known that their quest was completed? What was necessary in order for them to know mission accomplished? Only if they saw with their own eyes the newborn king. Epiphany is about the return of God's vision to his people. When God said, in the beginning, we communed face to face. And when I return my blessing to you, I am going to again show you my face. This is literally what the word epiphany means, to appear before. God appears before his people. He makes himself visible again. He shows his face again when he becomes human, when he becomes incarnate. And so we're like, okay, well, yeah, that's really sweet and wonderful, and we love holding babies and looking upon their glory, but I mean, is that just it? Like, what is Epiphany really doing? Why is there really a need for God to show his face again? Why is that so important in the blessing of God, the vision of God? And I'll tell you the best way that I know how to describe for you why Epiphany is so important is to take us to, we'll say, another Epiphany. This actually is one of my epiphanies. This is a very specific appearance of God in a very specific location. For any of you who have been to the high school down the road at Lumen Christi, you will know that this is inside Lumen Christi Chapel. And there are all kinds of locations. You can be in all kinds of places in that chapel. But there is one location in that chapel that every Wednesday morning I have a privilege to kneel down right there in that exact spot. And when I kneel down in that exact spot in the chapel and look up upon the altar with the Eucharistic Lord and the monstrance, this is literally what I see. I'm the only person in the whole room who can see it just like this. And what you notice in this moment, in seeing the monstrance, we know by faith that this is actually a vision of God. We know that this is an epiphany moment when God comes to make himself appear again before his people. But what's so special about this view of it? What's so awesome about this perspective of this epiphany? Well, what you notice principally is not simply the monstrance, but where the monstrance stands in relation to what's behind it. You're looking at the back wall of that chapel. And the back wall of that chapel is this really, it's a sort of a recent, depiction of a really ancient Greek icon called the Anastasis. Father Chaz, I think, mentioned this maybe a couple weeks ago in a homily. The Anastasis is what explains, in large part, the significance of the Eucharistic Lord. It's like, in order to understand Epiphany, you have to go back to this icon, which is Holy Saturday. You see, Epiphany and Holy Saturday are connected to each other. What's Holy Saturday? It's the day between Good Friday and Easter Sunday. It's the time between Jesus dying and Jesus rising. And in the ancient Apostles' Creed, we say that after Jesus died on the cross, he descended into hell. That's the English word translation of the Hebrew word Sheol, which more literally means like the dark underplace. It was also in Old Testament scriptures called the bosom of Abraham. The Anastasis, that icon, is the depiction of Jesus' descent into Sheol. Because the descent of Jesus into Sheol was also an epiphany. It was a moment where God appeared to his people. And what happened on Holy Saturday is he came down into the land of the shadows of death, and he took by the hand Adam and Eve, which you see. And around Adam and Eve, all the souls of the holy just before the time of Christ, who were awaiting in the shadow of the darkness of death, the Savior that would come to save them. So God, after his victorious death, descends into the bosom of Abraham and shows the face of God to the human race. And what happens when the face of God is shown to the human race? Well, what happened to Adam and Eve is that they went from here, the land of the shadow of death, into the land of everlasting life. Seeing the face of God causes the movement from death to life. And this is why Epiphany is so important. Why did God feel the need to make himself visible to us? Why did God come to earth to appear to us so that he could literally be seen by us? Because God knew from the very beginning that what his people longed for most, the biggest thing that they lost in falling from grace, was the vision of God himself, the beatific vision. And he wanted to return that to them. Because in seeing the face of God, what is communicated to all of creation is a share in God's life. This was the blessing of the vision of God's face upon his creation. It's what gave creation life. The vision of God's face upon it. God came to save, to make himself visible, so that by seeing his face, by seeing God again, we could move from death to life. And this is just another way to describe what it means to be transformed by grace. This is the entire journey of your Christian life upon this earth. God did not come to the earth to make bad people good. That wasn't his purpose. God came to earth to make dead people alive. And in order to make dead people alive, he has to show them his face. Because seeing the face of God is what communicates divine life to his people. Pretty trippy, huh? Yeah. Pretty awesome, though. And as Catholics, we're super privileged. Because one of the things we know by faith is that when God decided to show himself, he also decided that he would never again thereafter be unseen. He would remain to be seen, even until his return. And in the mystery of Holy Mass, in the mystery of the Eucharistic sacrifice, God, though he veils himself under the appearance of bread and wine, he tells us by faith, I say to you, when you look upon that, that is my body. We can literally have Epiphany anytime we choose. Anytime you choose it. Even here in Jackson, right? We have a couple Eucharistic adoration chapels. If you want to see the face of God, just go get in your car. When we walk this journey of the Christian life, it could be perhaps a thought or a temptation or a kind of perspective where we're like, okay, in order to complete this journey, maybe like the three magi, it's going to be long, it's going to be arduous. God's going to look down on you and he says, okay, you want to make it to heaven? Here's what you got to do. Go ahead, take your shoes off. Okay, you're going to walk barefoot up that 20,000 foot mountain. Whilst you do it, you're not going to be able to drink any water. Okay, you're going to get scorched by day. I'm going to give you a rope. You're going to flog yourself on the back by night. You're not going to get any sleep. But if you complete that task, then you can get to heaven. Right? We might think that. And God says, no, that's not what it means to gain life. If you want to gain life, you just have to look at my face. That's a lot better. I mean, I'll take that. I'll take that one instead. This is also why Mass is so beautiful and so important, because simply by looking at God's face, grace is being communicated to your heart that is moving your heart from death to life. And that movement, right, will be completed when we get to heaven. But it's so special. It's so special, the Epiphany of God. That began in the Magi, as he revealed himself to the nations, that continues upon every altar of sacrifice. That shows us that just as he did for Adam and Eve, so he will do for you and me.